Okay. We're going to select the stream. We're going to see how this goes. We're going to check out YouTube and see if YouTube can hear me and I can hear myself. Or maybe I'm just talking to myself. Who knows? Let's find out. Looks like I'm here-ish. Sort of. Good. Okay, I think we're here. So without further delay, I just want to share this stream on Twitter, and then we will get going. We will do what we can to get the show on the ROAD. So bear with us. Thanks so much. Just uno momento, and then we'll be up and running. Oh, you can hear me? Thank you. Appreciate you coming out, Jeff. All right. Just going to share this on Twitter, and then we'll get cracking. Almost there, I swear. I promise. Okay. All right. I think that's it. Okie dokie. Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whoever you are, wherever you are. I am Dr. Patrick Lockwood, and this is UnShrink Me. And because of legal purposes, I'm technically just Patrick. I'm not here giving you professional advice. So welcome to yet another episode of UnShrink Me. This is episode 62, somehow 62 weekends I've done this in a row. Amazing. A miracle. Thank you all for being here. For those of you who are brand new, UnShrink Me is a weekly podcast dedicated to you, the consumers of mental health services. So if you, a loved one, a family member, a friend, are in need of help with something mental health related, this podcast is dedicated to you specifically. Now, often, if you're a longtime watcher listener, you'll notice that clinicians will often come to the chat and discuss with me. However, everyone is welcome, but the goal is to make sure that two things happen every week. Number one, we talk about ideas in mental health that are trendy. Number two, we criticize them thoroughly and thoughtfully so that you, the consumer, can get the most out of whatever services you're seeking out right now. So please understand that this is not professional advice to you. This is just some guy who might know a thing or two who is talking about what is more helpful, more realistic, so that you have the best possible chance of getting what you want and what you need from your mental health professionals. So that is the spirit of UnShrink Me. I hope you find something today useful. And as always, this podcast is not NOT sponsored by Celsius, but I love this stuff, and God bless. God bless. So today on the podcast, lots of fun stuff to talk about. We're going to talk about kids in therapy. We're going to talk about couples. We're going to talk about all sorts of interesting stuff. And as always, I like to start with a warm-up post. Something that's maybe scandalous, but not too deep or anything. We'll see. And for those of you who don't know, I take every opportunity to connect with my colleagues, my friends on social media. So the app that I go to is Twitter, and I find posts on Twitter and then repost them while we're talking live, so you know what I'm talking about, so you can kind of timestamp it. And we, try to be reasonable and skeptical, but also fair to the person posting. So if you're not on Twitter, you should definitely get on Twitter. And my handle on there is at AlobhaPatrick, at ALOBHAPATRICK. And so I want to start with the softball from a colleague, I guess you could say. No BS Therapists. Club Exile says, I love it. It's still Twitter. Same here. Yeah, of course it's Twitter. It's not X. That's stupid. So, No BS Therapist is someone I've talked about before on this podcast. So let me just retweet this. And their handle is at tweetAtherapist. And so let me just post this real quick. Okay. Okay. So at tweet a paragraph. Oh, hey, good to see you, Ryan. Glad you're here, sir. So we got Ryan and we got Jeff here. We're doing good. We got a couple of good voices here to chat with. So post number one today, retweeted just now, is from No BS Therapist at tweet a therapist. She always has interesting stuff to say. Sometimes people like her, sometimes they don't. Whatever, I don't care. She has interesting, provocative things to say. So she posted a thread probably 6 days ago now, it looks like. And here's what she said on her thread. And I'm just going to read the very, very first post. I hope that you, again, get on Twitter and follow her because she says interesting and often useful things. So here's what she said. Feeling better after therapy is overrated. Feeling better does not equal getting better. Now, the reason I say this is a softball is because, yes, it is complicated, the concept of quote unquote feeling better versus getting better. But feeling better is overrated, by the way. And the reason I agree with her is because, genuinely speaking, there are dozens of things we can all do to feel better. That's one thing. But beyond just that, feeling better is, I would say, rarely a sign in therapy that you're actually, quote unquote, getting better. Now, people are going to come at me and say, but don't you want people to get relief or whatever it is? And fair enough, I certainly want people to find relief that's meaningful to them. But relief for relief's sake is not the same thing as, quote unquote, getting better. Most people, when they come to therapy, they have very specific problems they're trying to work through. Whether it's something diagnosable like major depressive disorder or something less diagnosable like a couples issue, which I'll talk more about later today. But feeling better is rarely the goal in therapy. I'll say that again. Feeling better is rarely the goal in therapy. In some people's cases, they desperately need to, or they might be at risk of taking their own life with drugs or suicide attempts of other kinds. So I understand that perspective. That being said, the vast majority of people in treatment, whether it's rehab or individual therapy once a week or couples therapy or counseling or coaching or whatever it is, most people that are seeking out mental health services don't actually want to feel better, number one. Number two, most people actually don't even want to get better because getting better requires hard work. It requires doing everything you can to address the problem that's like within your scope of power and influence. And most people don't want to put their whole back into it, as they say. And so the truth of the matter is most people don't actually want to get better or feel better. Some people do who are in therapy, and that's awesome and good job. If you're in therapy or coaching, counseling, or whatever it is, usually the more effort you put into quote unquote getting better, which is achieving your specifically agreed upon goals, versus feeling better, the more likely it is you're going to get what you want, generally speaking. And my buddy Ryan here in the chat says, if you aren't experiencing unpleasant emotions in therapy, he says, it's probably not very effective therapy. And just to vamp on that for a second, because I think it's worth elaborating on, psychotherapy for most treatable conditions like PTSD, anxiety disorders, depression conditions, obsessive compulsive disorder, things like that, or conditions you just manage like schizophrenia, bipolar, personality disorders. Like whether it's treatment or management, doesn't matter. These conditions, trying to have a better relationship with whatever that clinically defined problem is difficult. If you're not working, or excuse me, if you're actually doing work in therapy, you're probably going to have some difficulties. It's going to be difficult. You're going to struggle. That's not to say you won't have moments of relief or laughter, but that's not the same thing as having zero difficulties. Like I literally talked to someone this morning who's very smart and very insightful. I mean this literally. This very smart, very insightful young man I spoke to this morning said something to the effect of, I just want to be like this. And what I said to him was, that's a ridiculous goal. And the reason I said it's ridiculous is because that's not human. It's not human to be even keel all the time. It's not human to be happy all the time. It's not human to feel good all the time. That's absurd. I know a lot of people wish that because they've been miserable for so many months or years. And granted, if you have felt miserable for months and years, of course you are praying and hoping for just some stability across the board, just some like I feel good on a continual basis. And fair enough. That's still not the same thing as actually getting better. Now, what do we mean by getting better? Maybe No BS Therapist has some more specific definitions. I don't want to ruin the thread, so go follow her and read her thread. But what I will say is getting better often means developing new habits and patterns of behavior. And developing new habits takes a very long time, right? If you're struggling with some kind of low mood disorder like depression, major depression, and getting back in the habit of going for a walk once a day can be grueling for some people because they're just so miserable. They have anhedonia and amotivation that there's no physiological motivation, no intrinsic motivation to get up and go for a walk. So you have to literally force yourself, figure out how to force yourself. And that can take a long time for some people. So let me just say this again very clearly and hopefully relatively compassionately, which is getting better is very, very difficult and it rarely involves focusing on feeling better. For most people, when they have a mental health disorder of some kind, feeling better is a byproduct of getting better, right? So getting better means changing patterns, having a better relationship with your mind, which takes time and effort and is very hard. And feeling better comes as a byproduct of having a better relationship with your mind, changing your habits, and changing your relationships with other people as well. So just to reiterate and to summarize, feeling better is not the same thing as getting better. Almost rarely is feeling better the same thing as getting better. Basically never. Number two, getting better is very, very difficult. It requires a lot of discipline, a lot of accountability, a lot of focus, a lot of willingness to sacrifice what you wish to be true about yourself. Like probably the hardest thing for most patients in therapy is everyone has some story about themselves that they wish was true. A good story, a bad story, a lovely story, a terrible story that they are attached to in the Buddhist sense. They cling to this truth about themselves. And letting go of that truth, that story, is very hard for people. Then that is often part of getting better, is letting go of some story about yourself that's not true. And that doesn't feel good to let go of that story. To detach in the Buddhist sense takes a lot of energy and effort and patience and trust and faith, and most people have none of those things, especially if they're coming to therapy. So it's very hard to get better. And it takes time, and it takes courage, it takes discipline and accountability. And so I hope you're patient with yourselves. And I hope that if you expect to feel better, that you focus more on getting better and doing better. That's just my take, generally speaking. All right. And so post number 2 for today, which I think is of a piece with what I was just saying, is about couples. And so for those of you who don't know, if you're new to the podcast or you've never heard me say this before, I don't really do individual therapy. I don't really like it. It's not enjoyable. It's not fun. I don't care about your story. Whereas I have spent a great deal of my career, both in rehabs and clinics and private practice, doing a bunch of couples therapy and family therapy. So I have developed a lot of experience and I think fairly decent success rates with regard to families and couples. So because of that, this post was really intriguing to me, and I want to share it with you all because dealing with couples issues is challenging. Relationships are difficult often, and going to couples therapy can help, and it can be challenging. But I'm not advertising my services. I'm just trying to talk about something that I've seen and I think is relevant for a lot of people who watch this and listen to this. So this is from Lori Gottlieb, who I've talked about before in this podcast. Let me just retweet this real quick. Okay. All right. So 5 days ago, here's what Lori said. And I think this is a little bit more of an open thing, but this is provocative enough. She said, in couples therapy, it's helpful to ask. And by the way, her handle is at LORIGOTTLIEB1, at Lori Gottlieb 1. So here's what she said. Excuse me. In couples therapy, it's helpful to ask, do you want to express yourself, or do you want to understand what's happening between you right now? The second choice requires taking in new information. If you can't take in new information, you'll remain stuck. So when couples come to couples therapy, this has been my experience, and I think this is probably what she's referring to as well, Lori. A lot of times couples will say that they want to communicate better. And so they'll come in, they'll have an argument or a disagreement or a concern or whatever it is, and they'll look to you, the therapist, to help them figure out how to express themselves in a way that the other person can hear. That is a perfectly noble and valid goal, to learn how to express yourself better in a high pressure situation like a romantic relationship. That can take courage and perspective taking and trust, and learning how to express yourself in a way that the other person can hear is very difficult. But she said, here's what Lori said, just to reiterate, do you want to take in new information by understanding what's happening between the two of you, or do you just want to express yourself better? Because expressing yourself better is a valid and noble goal, but that problem of the dynamic between the two of you is a way more complicated problem. So, just to be clear, oh boy, sorry about that. Just to be clear, learning how to understand what's happening between two people in couples therapy versus what one individual in the dyad needs are two entirely different processes, even though they can be related. So this idea that it requires courage to change and to heal, I want to double down on for my first little retweet, because love is one of the more important things we experience while we're alive, in my opinion, as mammals. And it's very, very hard to trust often the people that you're in love with or you love, because most people that come to couples therapy at least have been burned, hurt, abused, neglected, traumatized, so on and so forth. And that's one of the reasons why they're there in the first place. So to me, I think it takes great courage to come try couples counseling or couples therapy. Just flat out. If you're in a relationship and you want to do the very vulnerable thing and sit in front of a stranger with your significant other and figure out what is going on between us and what is going on with me at the exact same time, you're basically doing double the work of individual therapy. And quite honestly, it's harder to do to do couples and family therapy, because it requires dealing with more people, and it requires being more open to different, let's say, iterations of things happening in the moment, which most people cannot help. So Club Exile has a really good question, and I want to make sure that I get to this, because you're like 30 seconds ahead of where I was going. So let me talk about what you're saying, Jeff. So Jeff asked a question in the chat. He said, won't understanding the other person or the dynamic between us help us express ourselves better? Actually, no, not at all. I don't think it's just my convenient sample of a clinical life. I think this is actually literally true across most couples situations. Having a better understanding of the differences or dynamics between two people is orthogonal. It's tangential to the goal of expressing yourself better, because depending upon what kind of information you're learning about the dynamic between the two of you, you may feel less comfortable opening up to your significant other, etc., etc. So something I've seen rather frequently in my career in couples therapy is we can talk about even super concrete things. Like I can think vividly of this story of a couple I worked with where they were trying to understand all the reasons. They even asked, like, what are all the reasons why we're struggling to get along? And so, being the nerdy, like, professor version of myself that I am, I actually started to work out a list of things with them. Now, that is a dangerous trap sometimes because people will use those as excuses and reasons not to relate to each other better. So, like, for instance, in this particular couple I'm referencing, literally the husband partner was like very middle of the road in terms of trait conscientiousness, whereas the spouse was much more conscientious, right, personality wise. And so that was a giant source of conflict for the two of them because she had more rigid standards than he did. And I think, all things considered, she was probably trying to look out for the relationship in a different way than he was. He's very go with the flow surfer type of dude. She's the opposite, basically. And so this this was really hard for both of them because they genuinely didn't understand. They couldn't grasp the other's internal world, if that makes sense. And grasping another person's internal world is actually very complicated. It's not very simple. Yeah, so Jeff is like, I took better expression to mean increased comprehension on the receiver's part. Yeah, but see, understanding the other person does not mean you're more motivated to actually live better with that person or do differently with that person. So, as the example I'm giving, it's like they understood their differences in terms of trait conscientiousness with me, and it didn't make things better or worse. It just clarified what they were already experiencing. So, understanding their story, like as you just said, Jeff, is important, but it doesn't necessarily prompt people to change because wanting to change has often, in couples therapy especially, little to do with understanding. It has to do with concepts like safety or being on the same page and demonstrating a pattern of behavior between the two of you that clarifies and reinforces the fact that you're not only on the same page with the same goal on the same team, but also that the changes you're making in the relationship, big or small, last, if that makes sense. So that safety, trust, reliability, all that stuff, understanding can make all of that stuff the same, worse, or better, but it doesn't usually correlate specifically to behavior change. Because just understanding your partner better does not actually mean you're more interested in doing differently. In fact, sometimes understanding the other person better makes you more hesitant about the relationship, makes you more skeptical of what is actually possible given their limitations, right? So Lori is onto something really important here, which is, do you want to express yourself better, which is a very noble and valid goal, versus do you want to understand what's happening between the two of you better? People, because of their fears and insecurities, their childhood stuff, their trauma, whatever it is, learning more information might make them trust you less. That's not unusual. So, expressing yourself better is important to couples therapy in general and to a healthy relationship. I think if you really love someone, you're going to be very like open and thoughtful about how you talk and try to talk better over time. Every successful relationship I have ever seen in my personal life, in my professional life, what I try to do in my relationship is communicate better when I can, right? And that requires courage and consistency and accountability. And very few people want to have courage, consistency, and accountability. Because courage is good and it's good temporarily, but consistency and accountability can be shame inducing. Some people are terrified of failing, and so they'll never try to change, in couples in particular, you know? So it's very complicated. And so props to Lori for highlighting the difference between expressing yourself better versus trying to take in new information and see your relationship differently. Because good couples therapy, in my experience, is about seeing each other differently and seeing the relationship differently. And then feeling motivated enough by that new perspective and an agreed upon trust in each other to do differently. And that requires courage. It really does. So, thank you, Lori, for the grist for the mill around couples. Couples are great, by the way. Couples are phenomenal and a lot of fun. And most relationships can be salvaged if you really are both committed, have similar enough values and shared goals. That doesn't mean it's easy. It's often very, very hard to make things right between a couple, but it is doable, and I never want anyone to give up hope. I really want people to try their best before they, call it quits in their relationship. All right. Next on the docket is my buddy Nick Tabor. And very grateful for Nick for always giving us good grist for the mill. So let me retweet this real quick. This is one of my favorite prestidigitations that we have to talk about. Okay. So, quite some time ago, April 4th, about a week ago, Nick Tabor said this, in quotes, "The move to blame the brain is actually an affront to learning and growth." Nick is quote tweeting someone else who's talking about it. But let me just state this very, very clearly. So I'm a professor teaching graduate students, very familiar with much of the neuroscience literature on motivations, mood, drugs, the brain. I teach psychopharmacology. I could keep listing all the reasons why I have this opinion professionally. Okay? So I have some reasonable basis for what I'm about to say. This is not just a wild take from someone who's never read research about the brain, PET scans, fMRIs, and understand how these things work actually, and how complicated the brain actually is. So let me say this very clearly, very carefully, because I think a lot of people are going to not like it, especially therapists. So dear patients, dear family members of patients, I want you to understand that many professionals do not know how to explain something without resorting to some appeal to the brain. And let me explain why this is just magic. Prestidigitation. Okay? So, there's 3 complicated reasons why the brain never matters in therapy. Okay? Complicated reason number 1 is, to the extent that we understand different types of disorders and the brain, we do not have, I'm going to say this very slowly, and I'm not trying to be discouraging, I'm just trying to be realistic. We do not have a fully coherent model that explains not just what symptoms look like in the brain, but also we have no clue what causes these dysregulations in parts of the brain. Number 1. We also have no clue, generally speaking, what a quote-unquote healed brain would look like. So there is no such thing as a depressed brain. We don't actually know across age, gender, and culture what depression looks like, so to speak, in the brain of most types of people. Is it true, on the other hand, that augmenting serotonin and norepinephrine can help some people? Absolutely. Sometimes psych medications work very well for some types of people. But the idea that we have a perfect or even reliable understanding of what's happening in the brains of people when they're struggling with depression is not true. And that's true for most disorders. Most. Some we understand. We understand Parkinson's disease pretty straightforwardly, for instance. Other mental health problems like OCD, we understand a little bit better. Schizophrenia, we kind of understand in terms of glutamate and dopamine and other things. Bipolar, not really. Not really. Most anxiety disorders, not really. Personality disorders, barely. So there's very little that we really fully coherently understand in terms of cause, maintenance, and healing. So that's reason number one why most discussions of the brain are superfluous. They're unnecessary. It's a magic act. Number two, the second reason that discussions of the brain in therapy are literally not useless. Number two, we don't know all the ways in which your brain changes throughout the day. Okay? Now, this might sound like some kind of throwaway comment, but let me tell you that it's genuinely not. Everyone's brains, all of our brains are changing every day, depending upon what kinds of drugs we use, how much activity we do, if we exercise or lift weights, if we have sex, if we eat good food, if we don't eat food, if we starve ourselves, fasting, if we get lots of sun, if we get no sun. There are quite literally dozens and dozens of things, variables, scientifically speaking, that you can change that will affect how your brain functions that day and expresses receptors for neurotransmitters and all these things. So let me say this very clearly for reason number two. As Ryan just said, change is the only constant. That's the JFK quote. Change is the law of life. And so your brain is changing every day, by the way. And so the idea that we could scan your brain at one point in time and it would look especially drastically the same, reliably the same, the next day or an hour from then is absurd. So your brain is always literally changing. And then big experiences, psychedelics, major traumas, major successes and joys, all these things will change your brain again. So your brain is not this static computer thing that you're fixing. That's an absolute bullshit model of the brain. Every time a tech bro, one you like, one you don't like, says that crap, they're idiots and they don't know how the brain actually works. So that's the second reason. You have a non-static brain. Reason number one, we have no clue what's actually wrong with your brain in a reliable way across age, gender, and culture. Number two, your brain is literally always changing. Not metaphorically, literally. Reason number three that talking about the brain in therapy is prestidigitation. And I hate to say this, and I don't mean this in a negative or mean or pessimistic way. The vast majority of therapists who are talking about the brain have no real relationship to the primary source imaging literature, fMRI, PET scan, SPECT, etc. They don't understand receptor dynamics. They don't understand a thing about receptor dynamics. They have no clue what receptor occupancy is, for instance. They don't understand 1/1,000,000th of the things that we currently know about the brain. So I would say 9.999 times out of 10 when a psychiatrist or a therapist of whatever degree level is talking about the brain, they don't know what they're talking about. They often have outdated models of what the brain is and how it works. For instance, if you have a therapist who says the phrase limbic system to you, that therapist doesn't know what they're talking about. If you learn more updated models of neural pathways and interconnections and things like that, you'll know that there really is no such thing as a limbic system. That's an outdated 1990s approach to the brain. So genuinely speaking, most therapists, as my colleague Ryan just said, oh, you're so right, I don't know shit about the brain, so I don't bring it up. Yes, exactly. That to me is ethical. Thank you so much. Exactly. That sentence right there, this is the quote from the chat right now. So, dear therapists, counselors, coaches, gurus of whatever kind, podcasters, if you're listening, I pray that you repeat the same sentence that my friend Ryan in the chat here just said, which is, I don't know shit about the brain, so I don't bring it up. I hope you never bring the brain up in therapy because you probably don't know anything. And the things you think you probably know are probably outdated as well. Very few people spend a lot of time living in the primary source literature and living in the complexities of the primary source literature about the brain. There are so many myths about the brain that people are taught in graduate school, which is why I, as a professor, care so much about reading so much about this stuff, so I don't repeat myths to my students, number one. But number two, so they don't feel encouraged to just go talking about stuff they don't understand. If you're a therapist, and even if you're a psychiatrist, I don't think the brain is in your wheelhouse to talk about. It's really not. And it's almost always sleight of hand. It's prestidigitation. I don't have a good way to explain and convince you otherwise. So what I'll do is I'll say some fancy shit about your cingulate cortex or your insular cortex or whatever it is. Your anterior cingulate is like a light switch, blah, 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 bullshit. And so let me just be extremely clear about this. It's sleight of hand almost every time a therapist brings up the brain. It really is. If your therapist, if your psychiatrist truly, truly understood the wild complexities of your very non-static brain, they would never talk to you about it. If they had ethics, they would literally never talk to you about it. And so for me, if you want to root out people who are incompetent from people who are more competent, if you're trying to screen for who's a good clinician, ask them about the brain and see what they say. Because sometimes they'll give you a very flimsy answer or a very TED Talk. You can always tell who has a TED Talk answer in their mind because they actually use TED Talk language, which is a bad sign. So for the love of God, if you're a therapist, counselor, coach, pastor, whatever it is, for the love of God, please, 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 please stop talking about the brain. I beseech you. I beg of thee, stop talking about the brain. As a professor who is fairly understanding of the primary source literature, both historically, going back to brain dissections hundreds of years ago, to presently, where we have cool X-ray crystallography and stuff like that, I genuinely barely ever think or talk about it because there's so much complexity. It is arrogance to pretend that I know enough to have a meaningful conversation with not only my students, but also patients about it. So there's some comments here in the chat I'd like to address. Jeff is like, I wonder that if that was all a myth now. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that was a myth. So he said, does the amygdala, hippocampus, prefrontal cortex play a role in PTSD? Understanding the mechanisms of trauma reactions is one thing that helped me to manage my own trauma. Good. I'm glad that understanding something helped you. So I haven't gotten to this part of my rant yet, but I will. He also says, I don't watch enough TED Talks to know what the language is. Good. Don't do it. It's bad for you. So here's the deal. You mentioned the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. It's like saying, does the sky play a role in the weather? Like, of course the sky plays a role in the weather. How could it not, right? So the idea that there are completely turned off parts of your brain or turned on parts of your brain is, again, neuromythology. Of course those parts of the brain are involved. It's just a question of in what specific ways, given your unique neurophysiology, chemistry, all these things, which is sort of predictable, but also sort of not predictable. So, excuse me, it's the sort of not predictable that bothers me. more than the stuff that's sort of predictable, because the sort of predictable stuff doesn't actually have explanatory power 99% of the time. So yes, those areas of the brain are almost always involved in everyone's PTSD, but also their depression and their schizophrenia and all sorts of things, because hippocampus has a lot of involvement in creating and retrieving memories. And so, like, memory is involved in every illness, literally. So I don't know what to tell you. Memory is involved in sensation, by the way. So I don't know what to tell anyone, but like the idea that we have some super neat and tidy diagram that will explain it is bullshit. And every time a therapist does that, it's bullshit. Now, let me speak to what you just said about how it was helpful, okay? So it's magic, and people love magic. Tons of people go to magic shows every year because they just love to be in denial or tricked or whatever it is, because it's entertaining to them. And the same thing is true in therapy. Many people come to therapy hoping the therapist will trick them, will give them some kind of like, how would you say, some enjoyable roller coaster ride experiences, because they have expectancies is the technical research word for it. So your expectancies will dictate how something helps you. So if you expect to learn about the brain and you expect that truth about the brain will allow you to feel more knowledgeable and aware and in control of your experience, then of course it will help you feel better. That's the power of expectancy, aka placebo. So I want everyone to understand that it's okay that understanding things is fun, and that sometimes if you feel like you understand something, you feel more in control, and that allows you to feel more motivated or more safe or whatever. I have no problem with that. I don't think doing it with deception is all that helpful or ethical. So my real point is just, I want therapists to stop talking about it, because I think there are ways, ethically speaking, to have psychoeducation conversations that help people, that don't hurt them, that aren't full of lies. You know, you can tell the truth that yes, we have some understanding of some brain dysfunction, blah, blah, blah. The truth of the matter is, we're going to help you feel more in control and have more agency, feel stronger, more capable. And it's true that our brains get stuck in unhelpful patterns and all these things, but it's a wild oversimplification. And that's what a lot of therapists do. This is the magic act of many therapists, is they engage in wild oversimplifications because they don't feel more powerful otherwise. And I'm not saying your therapist should be some pedantic nerd like myself, just so we're clear, if they were the most ethical. I think there are ways to not bullshit about neuroscience and the brain and achieve the exact same goal. So for instance, if you're out there and you're a counselor or a therapist, a coach, psychiatrist, whatever it is, if you want to avoid this appeal to authority, this appeal to the brain bullshit, you can say simpler things that are literally true and incontrovertible, right? You can do your best to tell the truth about the fact that whatever is happening in your brain, there are things we can do right now to help you feel better. That's a factual statement. Or that whatever injuries have happened because of trauma or whatever, they can heal. Things like that are very simple. And Drew here makes a really good point. Let me go back to the negative for a second. Many therapists will engage in intellectualizing, which is a defense mechanism for those of you who don't know. Many therapists will engage in the defense mechanism of intellectualizing because they're afraid of a deeper relationship or an uncertainty with the patient. Many therapists will resort to explaining things to you because they're terrified of being close with you as a professional in a professional relationship, as Drew just said in the chat. So thank you for saying that, Drew. I often think that most people who are using brain neuroscience talk in therapy are just wildly avoiding the present moment and avoiding contact with the patient. Ryan just said, it just isn't necessary. This is the quote. We can discuss a phenomenon that is occurring. It isn't necessary to know the exact mechanism of why the phenomenon occurs. Exactly. Knowing the precise ways in which your brain is quote unquote misfiring or whatever is actually true will not change what we do as therapists because our only tool is words. We leverage our feelings and the way we relate to each other to motivate people to act differently and see themselves differently. And none of that has any relationship to explaining some BS about the brain. That's just a gimmick. It's what politicians do. Politicians make things sound complicated because they're trying to lie to you. And that's what therapists often do too with this brain talk stuff. So for the love of dear God, I hope everyone who is a professional in the mental health world stops talking about the brain. I would pay so much money. I would give so much to just keep people to shut up when they want to talk about the brain. It's just absurd to talk about it when you don't actually understand it, number one. Number two, the brain's always changing, so who cares what you think you know? And number three, there's no such thing as a perfect and reliable understanding of any of these things. It doesn't exist. You know, very few illnesses are that simple. So we should not avoid the complexities of people by pretending fake complexities about the brain matter. You know? So I hope people understand that there's nothing wrong with finding solace or comfort in understanding that there are some correlates, some relationship problems you have with your brain, some misfirings, who knows, whatever. It's fine that you want a neat and tidy explanation. People like certainty over uncertainty usually. But that certainty will not drastically impact how you function as a person, especially not because of the brain. So please understand that it's okay to want to be interested and curious about the brain. I certainly am. And so I'm not trying to dissuade you of your curiosity. It's never appropriate, in my opinion, to talk about things you don't understand fully, especially, as Drew said, to avoid the relationship, to avoid something deeper, more important happening between you two as a professional. And if you're a patient and you think you're going to find some magical relief from understanding something about your brain and the wild complexity of your brain, I encourage you to think about another way of looking at your experience, because I think it's not going to give you what you want. And that's not really what helps people in therapy anyways. Knowledge is rarely what helps people in therapy. It is usually some felt sense, some relational experience that helps you feel more motivated to act and live differently. So, for whatever it's worth. So I think we beat that topic to death. But again, thank you, Nick Tabor, because again, the quote is extremely important. You know, it's literally the case, quite literally the case, that people will invoke the brain literally to avoid. He said the move to blame the brain is actually an affront to learning and growth. It's the avoidance of learning and growth. It is an emphasis on things that do not matter. Okay. So don't talk about the brain. If you're a therapist, coach, counselor, whatever, stop talking about the brain. Focus more on the clinical skills and the relationship you have with the patient, for the love of all that is holy or unholy, however you want to deal with it. Okie dokie. Okay. I thought I was going to talk about kids today, but I'm going to save that for next week. Okay. This next one is a little complicated, but very important. I might not get through everything I want to say, but I'm going to at least give it the old college try and give it a start. So Franny Fanny at proud_Penelope one day ago said the following. This is a long one, but it's worth it. She said, this is a thread about the person of the therapist does matter. Who the therapist is actually does matter for therapy. She said, no matter what one's theoretical orientation, things are going to go awry in treatment if the therapist, number one, takes things the patient says to them so personally they regularly become reactive. So if the therapist is personalizing, they'll be reactive. Number two, if the therapist cannot tolerate being the bad object, that matters, to the point where the therapist likely unconsciously will act in a way to keep the patient always nice and kind to them. Number three, if the therapist is so narcissistic that they regularly talk about themselves or cannot get out of the way enough to let the patient be alone in the presence of the therapist, sit with themselves. Number four, if the therapist is so stuck in primitive paranoid distortions, read the motives of others, that they do not only regularly misinterpret what is happening for the patient in pretty severe ways, but also, rather than take in the patient's corrections, double down and regularly wards off anxiety by being certain and knowing everything, which I just talked about. Note the words regularly and with enough frequency. Yes, we all get stuck in these places sometimes, but if it happens a lot, it's a red flag. So she put 1, 2, 3, 4 things out there. 4 problems that therapists struggle with that can impair therapy or cause therapy to become harmful. So I want to walk through these things so very, very straightforwardly and without passion. I'll do my best. So she said the person of the therapist does matter. So who you are as a professional certainly does matter. So number one, if you are a therapist who takes things that patients say personally, regularly, and become reactive about it, you are the problem. There's something wrong with you. You need to seek out consultation or supervision. That is bad. Yes, we are all people. Sometimes patients say things directly to us to hurt our feelings or something. Sometimes they are talking about things that matter to us, etc. Jeff says, passion is just fine. Well, we'll see. But the idea that you, as a therapist, are going to focus on how you feel and you're being offended or some stuff like that is a huge problem. If you're noticing as a therapist, counselor, coach, whatever, that you're worried about if you're going to be offended or you care about that, I'm worried about you. What is wrong with you such that you are more important than the patient? That's interesting. Maybe you're a little narcissistic and you don't know it, perhaps. Just something to consider. Number two, therapists who cannot tolerate being the bad object, she said, to the point that the therapist, likely unconsciously, will do things to make the patient like them. So this happens all the time, by the way, especially with newer therapists or less healed people who become therapists. It's very often the case that newer therapists are terrified of ruptures in the relationship. And because they're afraid of some kind of rupture happening between yourself and your patient, you'll do everything you can to people please. You'll try to make things good between the two of you. You'll rush to repair things or to do everything you can to make them look good or be nice to you or be nice to them. And that is bad, by the way. Don't do that, dear therapists, because sometimes it is clinically useful, not all the time, but sometimes it's very useful if you can be the bad guy, the bad object, right? So just to name a very specific example, I speak somewhat authoritatively, I guess you could say, and I happen to be a male, at least to the best of my knowledge. And as a somewhat older, authoritative male, I typically give people dad vibes when I talk to them. And so some patients will project their dad stuff onto me, and many people have had very bad dads in their life. And so because I am a dad-like figure to many people, I will be the bad dad in the room. They'll have bad dad reactions to me. And that is A-okay, by the way. However, it's very important to be able to tolerate being the bad object. And if you can't tolerate it, that means something is wrong with you as the therapist. So go figure it out. Find a consulting clinician or a supervisor or something like that, for the love of God. Number 3, near and dear to my heart, if the therapist is so narcissistic that they regularly talk about themselves or cannot get out of the way enough to let the patient be alone in the presence of the therapist. So that's very specific wording. Let me try to walk it out. So the first half of this is if the therapist is so narcissistic that they keep talking about themselves. So many therapists, especially newer therapists, but sometimes seasoned people, love the sound of their own voice. I, for instance, love the sound of my own voice in the narcissistic sense. So what I have done, what I've tried to do, is I've tried to create a series of outlets where I can get that narcissistic need met because I am built differently. So I have a podcast where I talk for an hour. I also am a professor where people have conversations with me for a living. And I am, let's say, I'm obligated to talk and have people listen to me. So I'm trying to get those needs met adaptively and in a quasi-pro-social way, as opposed to a very antisocial way where I just bombard people with my brilliant and profound thoughts without their consent all day, etc. So therapists do this. Therapists feel so insecure sometimes where they will just ramble about what they believe is true and they'll wax philosophical. And the patient barely talks in many sessions. That's narcissism. That is an avoidance mechanism in many ways. Or the other half of what she said was the therapist cannot get out of the way enough to let the patient be alone. So sometimes therapists care so much about what they look like that they're terrified of the patient feeling like they're alone in the relationship, which really is usually about the therapist. So to be more clear about that and concrete about that, if you are the kind of narcissistically oriented or organized person where you feel alone chronically, you may project that onto the patient. We call that countertransference, especially if that patient is similar to you in some ways. And so you might fill up the room with talk because you're terrified of feeling alone and you're terrified of the patient's feelings of being alone. That's very important for you to consider if you're built that way. And number 4, and I don't have a lot of time, but I'm just going to try and do this very straightforwardly, and I can come back to it next week if you all want. But she said the therapist is stuck in primitive paranoid distortions about the motives of other people, that they not only regularly misinterpret what's happening for the patient, but also don't even take feedback from the patient when they're trying to correct you, right? So sometimes therapists will give a patient an interpretation that's wrong. But the patient will try to correct what you said that's wrong, and you won't listen to them as a therapist. That's a problem. That's usually because the therapist is terrified of being wrong for narcissistic reasons, for borderline personality reasons, or because they're terrified of reality themselves in kind of a paranoid schizoid way. And so if you're a therapist and you cannot tolerate your patient correcting you in a minor way or even a big way, that's something you should really think about and take seriously. And if you're a patient and you're trying to discuss in whatever way you can what you believe is true and your therapist cannot tolerate it, that's kind of a problem. You know, Ryan says, these are great, seeing this stuff frequently when providing supervision. Absolutely. I see this as a supervisor myself. I see the exact same things. So if you're a consumer of therapy and mental health services, please be aware that your therapist often has problems that they're not aware of and they can't see. And so it's not your fault sometimes if your therapist misunderstands you, misattunes to you, or talks too much. It's often their fault because they can't tolerate uncertainty, whatever's going on with you, something that's countertransference, etc. So thank you, Franny Fanny, for that post. Ryan says, I get so pumped when my patients correct me, especially when we find expression of their self frightening. Yeah, of course, absolutely. It's important for sure. Being corrected is important because I will get things wrong and I will misunderstand or have my own stuff in my head and misinterpret. So I'm a person, I'm flawed, I will make mistakes. I need feedback from colleagues, from peers, from patients to make sure that I'm correcting and heading in the correct direction with people. So I hope this has all made sense to everyone. We've talked a lot, a lot about important things today. And, normally I end this podcast with a joke, and I think it's okay to go over time today. So without further delay, here's today's joke of the day. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Please, 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 please like, share, and subscribe. I'd like to build this audience so we can get more people quality feedback about what it means to be in good therapy. And this is not specific feedback to you, the patients, families of patients. Don't sue me, blah, blah, blah. I'm not your therapist, your consultant, etc. This is just a podcast. Some guy screaming into a microphone. Some random dude with a jacket. And please like, share, and subscribe. Please find me on Twitter. Come at me, DM me, talk to me. Let's talk about these things. I want to be of service however I can. So without further delay, here is today's joke of the day. So I once had this patient who had essentially what looked like a phobia of cars. I've never seen this before in my career. It was very, very unusual. I'm a car guy, so it was very hard for me to wrap my head around, for sure. And so anyways, this dude walked into therapy saying, I cannot sit in cars for very long. I start to freak out and have panic attacks, all these things. So it sounded like specifically a phobia of cars. And so anyways, excuse me, we talked about it. We tried to figure out where does this come from? What's happening? Because a lot of people with phobias have trauma, right? And so he told me the story in the first session about his mom dying in a tragic car accident. Okay, fair enough. So he's got this phobic response to cars because his mom died in a car accident. Makes perfect sense. Couldn't be more linear and logical and crystal clear. Sometimes it is. So we start working together, exposure, hierarchy, all these things you're supposed to do with these kinds of phobias and traumas and things like that. And it was going fairly well. Get into session 5 or 6, month number 2 together. And he starts dating this woman who is really into cars. And he says he really likes her, but she's a car girl. She grew up with a dad who was into racing, was a race car driver. And so she really likes cars. And she keeps talking about cars. And he's like, he likes her because they have very similar values and principles and taste in movies, stuff like that. So there's a lot positive checkbox, all that good stuff. Intimacy is good, all sorts of things. So he's really conflicted, he's telling me, because, exposure therapy is going well and stuff, but he was starting to get really worried that she's going to ask him to go on a drive or whatever it is. And so he comes into therapy the next week and he says, Doc, I'm terrified. She wants to go to a racetrack together and I don't think I can handle it. And so I said, okay, what do you think we can do? Can we game plan? What can we do to help you tolerate this if you choose to say yes? So we came up with a exposure therapy kind of relapse prevention plan for this racetrack date with his girl. And he went and did it apparently. And he came back the next week and basically told me the story. They went to a racetrack. She rented a Porsche or something and drove really fast with him around the track. And it was pretty wild. And so he's telling me the story, and the story is fascinating. So he came back and he said, basically, Doc, I don't think I have any fear of cars anymore. I'm like, wow, what happened? What did you guys do on this date of yours? And so he tells me the story, got this fancy car. She's in the driver's seat because she loves cars, and he's terrified. He's sweating through his shirt. And he has no clue what's going to happen. And he's losing his mind, and they're driving around the track, and she's going 95, 110 miles an hour and all this stuff, and he's losing it. And as she's going fast, she starts to grab his crotch out of nowhere, unexpected, unplanned. And she's like rubbing on him while she's driving fast. And he's starting to get aroused, as you can imagine. He tells me the story about it. And basically, when they're done driving, he's had like this giant adrenaline dump. He's sweating, but he's also excited, to say the least. And they park. They kind of stop the car and park, and she's like so pumped. She's got adrenaline flowing. He does too. They start making out, and it's like really exciting, he says. And they leave. They have a really good time. They go home. They have an extra good time, apparently. And over the next week, they hang out. They go on dates together. They drive together. He drives home. She drives home. And he has zero fear reaction, zero sweating, anything. And he's like, Doc, I think I cured my fear of cars by just going on this date with her and stuff. And I said, yeah, it sounds like you really found someone that revs your engine. All right, folks, have a good rest of your weekend. I hope you eat really well, take good care of yourself that way, sleep as good as you can, and exercise and move as much as you need to. I will see you next week, next Saturday, 3 o'clock, 3:30 Pacific Standard Time. Have a good time.